Well, thank you very much. It's a delight to be with you today through the miracles of Zoom and translation. I'm especially pleased to share the results of my research with people around the world. So I thank you very much. I'm going to screen share now, and I have taken the liberty, thanks to our translators and translation, of putting my information into Portuguese on the slides, but I will be reading it in English while Angela, our wonderful translator, translates. So we will begin now. So this is just a copy of the cover of my book, which I would love to get translated, but not yet. So today we are going to talk about the prophetic authority and leadership of women in early Christianity. And we will cover three major areas. The first is the sociocultural context of early Christianity, female evangelists, and the expansion of Christianity. The second, and probably this is one of the most important methodological items, we will be looking at art and archaeology as sources of information about early Christian women. And thirdly, we will be looking at women and authority in the literary record, as well as on 4th century catacomb frescoes and Christian sarcophagi, which are marble tombs. And this is a picture of the scope of the Roman Empire during the 1st and 2nd century, during which Christianity spread. Right up into, well into the 4th and 5th century. So just a bit about the Jesus movement, which spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire because of the initiative of female prophets, evangelists, missionaries, heads of house churches, and widows. It also grew because of financial support, and this is one of the little known things, from Christian businesswomen, such as Mary of Magdala, who was from Magdala, so scholars believe and Joanna, who was the wife of Herod's steward Chusa, as Luke 8 tells us, both had access to means, and they were among the many women who supported Jesus' Galilean discipleship from their resources, which scholars now believe means they financially underwrote Jesus' mission. Also, Lydia in Acts was a purple dye trader, and when Paul converted Lydia, he also gained access to her whole business network. And then, of course, Phoebe, we remember her a lot in the West as a deacon, but her better known title was benefactor. So Phoebe in Romans 16 was one of the people who underwrote Paul's mission. And then last but far from least, and this is just an example, but Olympias is a 4th century woman deacon from Constantinople who basically underwrote every bishop in Asia Minor, but more about that later. So all of this led Pope Benedict XVI on February 14th, 2007, during his daily thing, he loved to do teachings in his audiences. And when he said, and I quote, "The history of Christianity would have turned out very differently without the contribution of women." And he also noted the female presence was anything but secondary. So how did this come about? Well, early house churches were led by women such as Grapte, a 2nd century leader of communities of widows and orphans, whom we read about in the early document, The Shepherd of Hermas. Also Tabitha in Acts, she was a 1st century widow who was, quote, a 1st century widow devoted to good works and acts of charity, who founded a house church in Joppa. And through this house church mechanism, early Christians gained access to social networks that brought them into contact with people from diverse social classes. And this is one of the foundational mechanisms through which early Christianity spread across the empire. And here's how. When a female head of household, perhaps a wealthy widow such as Tabitha, or a freed woman such as Prisca, whom we read about in Romans 16, when they converted to Christianity, Christian evangelists such as Junia, who was called an apostle in Romans 16, through these women, Paul gained access not only to their domestic household, but also to their patronage network. This meant that slaves, freed persons, children, relatives, patronal clients of people like Lydia would convert as well. And so when Paul converted Lydia, he automatically gained entry to a broad swath of social relationships and a potentially wide audience. Most Christian women were probably freeborn or freed people. They were capable, and this is another little known fact, I think in contemporary we think these early women were very poor and pregnant and trained to, chained to the stove. I don't know if that translates, but that they were not, most of us have no idea that they were actually capable of acquiring wealth and therefore status through small businesses, such as processing wool, negotiating in purple dye, such as Lydia, and tent makers, such as Prisca. In their extensively researched book, A Woman's Place, Dr. Carolyn Osick and Margaret Y. McDonald demonstrate that within their Christian social networks, lower class Christian women could begin businesses and become financially secure. This brought with it a higher status and freedom of movement, especially throughout the extended household of antiquity. The Jesus movement's wholehearted embrace, and this is another key thing in the spread of early Christianity, Jesus movement's wholehearted embrace of an egalitarian social ethos, particularly with regard to the leadership of women, even slave women, was shocking to more than a few in the broader Greco-Roman culture. Women's public leadership was unsettling to the mainstream culture. Based as they were on gendered understandings of public and domestic space, the Greco-Roman household codes eventually became normative in church structures as well as in families. And those codes, just a little bit of an explanation, said that women should stay home and tend to the household, and the whole wives be submissive to your husbands kind of norm was the norm throughout the empire, although many of these applied more to the elite classes than to lower classes in which Christianity lived. Anyway, so from the early 2nd century to the early 5th century, male church leaders repeatedly cited 1 Timothy's admonishment. And just an aside, 1 Timothy was not written by Paul himself, but a later admirer, and it has much in the letter. I wouldn't undo it, but there are certain things that are not Pauline. And his admonishment that women are to be silent in the churches, they use this text to justify curtailing female authority. And just compare this with Paul and the Corinthians telling the Corinthian women prophets to cover their heads when they are speaking in church. He wasn't telling them to be silent. Christian women, however, and a few good men, took initiative outside of patriarchal norms because of their belief in Jesus. And so, despite official sanctions, women persisted in teaching, preaching, and evangelizing and baptizing. So, between the 1st and 4th century Roman society, there are 3 significant differences between for the 1st century and the 4th century Roman society that we can attribute to the evangelization and leadership ministries of Christian women. First, by the 4th century, the freedom to choose a life of celibacy, and this is a whole other strand in and of itself, because celibacy was not part of Roman culture at all. But the freedom to choose a life of celibacy effectively dismantled one pillar of patriarchy, which is mandatory marriage. And of course, women were basically bargaining chips, expanding the wealth of the patriarchal household. But because they could choose celibacy and it was admired within Christianity, uh, that gave women other options. The second difference is that Christian widows and virgins rescued, socialized, baptized, and educated thousands of orphans who would otherwise have died of exposure or been doomed to prostitution. It was common practice in Rome. The paterfamilias had to accept the child who could have been the offspring of a slave uh, because they had access to all the slaves in their family sexually. So there were children that would not have been accepted, and then they would have been exposed on the hillside and doomed to a life of prostitution, except for the fact that the Christians rescued them and baptized and educated them. The third difference is that the domestic networking and evangelizing activities of women played a leading role, as we have seen affirmed by even Pope Benedict. They played a leading role in transforming Roman society from predominantly pagan to a predominantly Christian culture. So women's countercultural exercise of authority in the context of everyday domestic life is one often unnoticed key to Christianity's rapid expansion. The missionary authority and prophetic leadership of women within their extended social networks actually changed the face of the Roman Empire. Now we'll take a look at women in authority on Christian sarcophagi, and I'll give a bit of an introduction here. Because most of history relies on the literary records authored by men, discovering reliable historical data about early Christian women can be very challenging. And this is true of all history, not just Christian history. The historians write about what is of interest to them, and since women were not valued historically, what was of interest to the male historians was things that were interesting to men, and so we don't hear too much about women. Christianity is no different than other areas of history in that it relies heavily on the written word as a primary means of understanding our history. Information gleaned and to be found in visual artifacts such as frescoes, paintings, and sarcophagi friezes has until only very recently been left just to the art historians and archaeologists, not so much to the Christian historians. And so even though many female patrons financially subsidized the men in the early church, Mary Magdalene, Phoebe, Lydia, Paula, as we have seen, we'll learn more later about them also. Even though these women subsidized and helped men in the early church expand, their presence, the presence of women, can barely be found in literary sources. Scholars soon realized that archaeology could be a very important source of information about early Christian women. So, for the first 4 centuries of Christian history, and even today, churchmen justify curtailing female authority by repeating 1 Timothy's rule that, quote, women must be silent in the assembly and must not teach or have authority over men. However, Christian funerary art from the late 3rd until the early 5th centuries shows women both teaching and preaching. And only a brief discussion is possible here. A more detailed treatment can be found in my book, Crispina and Her Sisters. For Romans, whether Christian or pagan, a sarcophagus, or the marble tomb, was a monument filled with meaning, not just a container for a corpse. Roman funerary art was meant to construct the identity of the deceased person and commemorate their values and virtues. And another side note before the next slide is that only the wealthy could afford this kind of commemoration, and planning for how one wished to be remembered was an important process for both Christians and non-Christians. Being portrayed with a scroll, a capsa, which is a basket for scrolls, or a codex, which is a book, was an instant indicator of the deceased, the departed, the dead person's learning, status, and wealth. And as we shall see, both Christian women and men were commemorated and idealized as persons of status, authority, learnedness, and religious devotion. When the deceased person's funerary portrait was depicted with a scroll or capsa in close proximity to biblical scenes, it also signaled learnedness about the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. And just a note about portraits, that is a representation of the deceased person that is carved onto their tomb. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But I want to first reference an analysis of the non-Christian portrait sarcophagi made in Rome. And Steinberg is a Danish art historian who did an excellent study of the non-Christian portrait sarcophagi in Rome that was completed just before I did my own study. So it gave me a whole cohort then to compare the Christian tombs to. So this is an important piece for the future. And of the 677 non-Christian portrait sarcophagi that Burke studied, we can see that there is an equal number of solo male and solo female portraits. And so the conclusion is, in non-Christian Roman funerary art sarcophagi, there are equal numbers of portraits of deceased men and women. As we shall see through my research, it's very different findings for Christian funerary sarcophagi, where the female portrait sarcophagi outnumber the male by 3 to 1. And so let's go on to the next thing about now Christian Roman funerary art. And here is what we can discover from this art. It provides information about how early Christian women and men self-identified. It also provides information about how they were viewed by their families and friends. And this is why the portrait piece is so important, because it's only from that can we infer that the art placed on their sarcophagus was actually chosen by either the deceased or their family. Okay, let's turn now to some Christian catacomb frescoes, which is another important source of information, which are included in the book, but I did not study them specifically, but just summarize the findings of other scholars. But it's also fascinating. And this is a fresco from the catacombs of Domitilla in Rome that dates to the late 4th to mid-5th century, of Veneranda, which is this lady on our left here, which means she who is to be venerated. It is her tomb. She is dressed in the robe consistent with late 4th, early 5th century female garb. To her left, our right, is the woman Petronilla, who is dressed more in 1st century garb, no veils, tunic. And the deal is, so there are two women from two different historical periods, and next to them are signs of their ministry. This at the bottom is a thing called a capsa with a shoulder strap, which is a basket for carrying scrolls. Or in the early 1st century, it was Hebrew scripture scrolls that they were carrying, because these were what itinerant missionaries would carry going from place to place. And so this is Petronella's ministry. This codex above is a sign of Veneranda's, which because codexes didn't come in until later in the fourth century, 4th to 5th century into common use. And so this is Veneranda depicting herself as following in the footsteps of Petronella, as proclaiming the scriptures. The presence of the Codex and Capsa are signs of their important preaching and proclamation ministries. And we'll just say, in case you think I was kidding you, this next slide, which is right around the corner in the Catacombs of Domitilla, is Paul, depicted as he usually is with this long, thin face and pointy beard, holding a scroll, and right here is a capsa, also a sign of his early preaching proclamation ministry. Here is another catacomb art from the catacombs of St. Januarius in Naples. Battalia is her name, is a remembered for her, I think, I'm sorry, for her ministry of the word. And above her, she's in an orans prayer position with gospel texts above her, Johannes, Marcus, Matthias. And she, again, the art, since the art always conveys the most important thing about a person's life, the presence of the books of the gospel listed by name is highly significant. At the very least, Battalia must have been intimately involved in preaching and proclaiming the good news for the Christian community in which she ministered. Here is another, also in the catacombs of San Januarius, of Cerula, probably Cerula is how it should be said, in Pace. And again, you see here with the scrolls above, she's got a Christogram, Christ is the beginning and the end, above her head. And here is Paul in this proclaiming, acclaiming posture. And over here was probably an image of another apostle, probably Peter, but we'll get into that in a minute. Now let's move to the Christian sarcophagi and my original research. And here we see Crispina herself. One of the reasons I chose that for the topic of the book, it's one of the few people for whom we have an actual name. And you can see her cradling a codex here with a Christogram on it, the Kiro symbol of, I'm sorry, not a Christogram, a Kiro symbol of Christ. All of this testifies that she was literate, a leader, and a devout woman of the word. This next sarcophagi frieze shows a preaching woman of the word. And again, I say this is because her hand is here in the preaching, proclaiming gesture that probably derives from early Greek theater. And here she's holding a codex. And so this deceased woman wanted her final memorial to be one which shows her preaching, proclaiming, and teaching about the Bible passages that appeared on her tomb. And you can see this is what we just saw. To our left, we see Peter converting the jailers, and all of these are from the Acts of Peter, which was very popular in Rome. The arrest of Peter. This is probably Ezekiel raising the dead, but it could also be Jesus raising the son of the widow of Nain. To our right, we see Jesus healing the blind person, the multiplication of the loaves. You can see all the little loaves down here, and Jesus' triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So these are the things that she wanted to be remembered for. Just one comment, you'll see this little wand here. And it's because the early Romans didn't have a category for miracles. So they often depict Jesus or other holy figures doing miracles with a wand. Their category was magic. I always like to think of it as our Harry Potter Jesus. Anyway, another interesting thing about some of this early Christian art, especially around the authority piece, in non-Christian Roman art, when both a man and a woman are depicted together, The man always and without exception holds a scroll. Now, and you can see, and here it is. Here's the man, his hands in a teaching breast, his wife in a supportive gesture next to him. This is not the case in Christian funerary art. In fact, my research found in 6 couple portrayals with women with scrolls or speech gestures, there was a role reversal, and that is that the women often hold the scroll in all 6 of these. Okay, and you can see here again, the woman with the scroll, her husband in this teaching gesture. Her name is Eugenius, and her tomb inscription tells us she died at age 57 after 41 years of marriage. Both faces are individualized. These are portrait tombs. And when we recall another little known fact, that in the 3rd to 2nd to 5th century, higher status Christian women routinely married men of lower status. So it also makes sense that their funerary art would reflect this reality. Just a little thing there. So a bit more about my own research. It was conducted over a 3-year period. The study analyzed 2,119 images and descriptors of 3rd to early 5th century sarcophagi and fragments. And I owe a great deal to Dr. Umberto Utro at the Vatican Museums, who pointed me to the 3 German volumes of plates, which were at the time all publicly available images of Christian sarcophagi. And it's rare that you get an opportunity to look at the whole universe of data. So this was a gold mine for me. Anyway, here's a breakdown of how I looked at every single one of these images, entered them into a database, and here's how we ended up with what I studied. Sorry. Out of the total artifacts recorded in the database, I just had 762 because very, very many images were just fragments and carvings and nothing significant. Out of those 762 recorded, 558 were definite Christian sarcophagi, and I analyzed these very strictly. I did not define it as Christian unless there were actual biblical figures on the tomb. And out of this 558 depictions, I found 312 Christian portraits. And again, these are the deceased, depicted with a biblical figure, portraits of the deceased, 312 portraits on 247 tombs. Just to note that sometimes some tombs had more than one portrait figure. So, an in-depth analysis of these selected iconographical motifs of a number of selected, I'm not going to go into all of them today because it would take forever, but some of the main ones found that many early Christian women were commemorated as persons of status, influence, and authority within their communities. One highly significant finding that I alluded to earlier is that there are 3 times as many solo funerary portraits of Christian women compared to solo portraits of Christian men. And this was, I never dreamed I'd find something this huge. The likelihood that this finding is due to chance is less than 1 in 1,000. So it's highly significant that there were 3 times as many Christian women. And this is how it broke out. Solo female were 156, solo male were 47, couple was 64, children was 20, embedded, that's another probably somewhat esoteric distinction, but there were Christian, probably portrait images embedded in some of the other art. And again, so I was amazed. I did not ever think I would find something that significant. And of course, it's significant is because the literary scholars had long suspected that women were far more influential in early Christianity than commonly recognized. And here we have the archaeology confirming that, which, what a dream. So many sarcophagus reliefs also portray the deceased woman surrounded by biblical scenes with their hands in a speech gesture and holding scrolls or codices. And again, those are the signs of status and authority and literacy. And so here's how that broke out. There were no statistically significant differences between male and females portrayed with these signs of status. And again, you had to do statistics because the numbers were so unequal. So all of this, these offer about the scrolls and codices poignant witness that 4th century women did not heed admonitions to be silent. Their prevalence also suggests the emergence of a new female identity, a biblical learnedness, and teaching authority. And I just point, this is sort of humorous. This is a stained glass depiction of Pope Pius X from a local parish in Cleveland, which shows us how long the longevity of artistic symbols of Christian authoritative teaching. We have a speech or teaching gesture here, and we have a codex over here. So, these things last, it's pretty amazing. Here is another configuration that I studied, and that is a woman in a praying posture. At her feet, there's a scroll box, and she is remembered both for her literacy and her prayerfulness. And again, in so many times, the early interpretations would show anybody in Iran's posture as a soul, not as a real woman, regardless of the distinctiveness of the art. So this is the whole, her whole tomb. This is called a stridulated sarcophagus, by the way. And on either side of her, we see these in-facing apostle figures, probably Peter with his short hair and scrolly beard. I don't know about this one, but both of them are acclaiming her, and both of them are also showing their status with scroll bundles at their feet. So now I'm going to do a little bit more about women who are portrayed with these in-facing, quote, apostle figures. And this is a phrase I coined or I created because it's very significant as far as women in authority. And so another significant finding was that female portraits were statistically twice as likely to be flanked by these apostle figures, often Peter and Paul. And I think that this is probably to validate their religious authority. And here are the numbers on that. 73 female depicted with these in-facing apostle authority depictions, 10 male. Oh, and another significant thing here is that Christ was 166 depictions in that way. And so just to unpack this a little bit, here is a deceased woman holding a scroll flanked by this in-facing apostle. And this, so that just said, so you see, they're both looking in. She's holding probably a codex. Anyway, and then here we have a detail of the portrait of Marcia Romania Celsa from Arles in France. Her husband was a consul, and she has a gorgeous tomb in the museum in Arles. And her elaborate 4th century tomb includes abundant biblical themes. And again, she is shown in front-facing prayer posture, scroll bundle at her feet with these two in-facing apostle figures. Just so you have an idea of where this came from, this is Jesus teaching his disciples portrayed in a typical authoritative posture. Again, hands and speech gesture, scroll, and two in-facing figures. This is from the sarcophagus of Stilicho in the Pio Cristiano Museum. Okay, and here is one, Jesus teaching his disciples, and again, it's a sarcophagus of Junius Bassus. Again, scroll and facing apostle figures authoritative. And here is a non-Christian Roman sarcophagus that it, they've dubbed Plotinus, but they don't really know. But two major scholars, art historians, Felicity Harley and Barbara Borg, say this non-Christian portrayal of a Roman magistrate became the model for how Christians portrayed Christ's authority. So I think we can see then from this, we can make the allusion. The only thing that's different is that in the other figures, Christ is always seated on a chair, a cathedra, but the in-facing thing is obvious. So the early Christian iconography then suggests that female Christians were learned, pious, and wealthy. And judging from the number of solo female sarcophagi, they were also single women or widows, evoking the early communities of widows and virgins. And some of these eventually evolved into early women's communities. Since many of these women are shown with scrolls and speech gestures in the midst of biblical scenes, we can also posit that they were well versed in scripture and wished to be represented as women with faith in God's power to save and as teachers about Jesus' life and teaching miracles. Their communities idealize them as learned figures with authority to, at the least, proclaim and teach scripture. And just a little aside before the next slide, it's plausible that later Roman mothers of the church, such as Marcella, Paula, Melania the Elder, and Proba, admired these early female role models who inspired them to love and learn about scripture. And literary sources about our church mothers are consistent with the archaeological findings confirming what contemporary scholars, including Pope Benedict, had previously theorized, and which I have said previously. Women were considerably more influential in early Christianity than is generally recognized. So while men predominate in the literary record, archaeological funerary portraits point to a preponderance of Christian women who were remembered as exercising substantial ecclesial authority within their communities. As we shall see, women who gathered around our church mothers developed into some of our earliest intentional communities of women religious. Now let's take a look at who were some of these 4th century mothers of the church. Yes, okay, this is just a little prelude. The 4th century began with severe persecution of the church, particularly in the East. After invoking the Christian God in a protracted power struggle, Constantine became emperor. The church rose to unprecedented heights of worldly power and influence, thanks to the imperial favor of Constantine, his sons, and his mother Helena. Churchmen also received extravagant benefices from aristocratic Christian women such as Olympias, Melania the Elder and Younger, and Paula. Christian communities that formerly met in large homes or buildings now found themselves in sumptuous public surroundings, and these changes exacerbated tensions between the public ministry of Christian women. So, just to sum up this first part about the female tomb iconography, compared with women in the 4th century literary sources, which I'll get into in just a moment. And that is that, again, the funerary iconography indicates that at the least, these women proclaimed or taught scripture. And literary sources attest that Marcella, and again, these women, Marcella, Macrina, Egeria, Melania the Elder, Melania the Younger, were wealthy, well-educated, married, and single women. And these women actually occur after Constantine and Helena transformed the church, the empire, but especially the church. So let's take a look now at what was happening then in the 4th century. And this is from literary sources. It saw a distressing tendency to symbolically associate the female sex with heresy, even though both Christian men and women were involved in the disparate interpretations of Christianity that were eventually labeled heretical. Women were especially at risk of being labeled heretics and suspected of unchastity if they assumed the role of teacher. So just given what we've just heard, this is the ecclesial context within which 4th century church mothers, whether shown in the sarcophagi or through the literary record, this is the context in which they lived and witnessed. So now let's take a look at some of the women that we know from literary sources, and all of these were from histories written by men. The first is Macrina, who founded a monastery in Anissa in Asia Minor. Her monastery became the prototype for a monastic rule written by her brother Basil. And again, just a little bit about Macrina. She was also sort of the oldest, and she was also a spiritual advisor to Basil and Gregory, both of whom went on later to formulate the doctrine of the Trinity. Anyway, Basil was later credited, he founded his own monastery, as the father of monasticism, even though his prototype was the one Macrina had founded. So we can certainly think of Macrina as the mother of monasticism. And as I said, her authority profoundly influenced her theologian brothers Gregory and Basil. Here we have Marcella, who gathered women to study scripture and pray in her aristocratic home on Rome's Aventine Hill, fully 40 years before Jerome ever arrived in Rome. And the reason that's important is Jerome became sort of like a scholar in residence at Marcella's home. And after he returned to Jerusalem, Rome's priests came to Marcella for help clarifying biblical text. She also engaged in public debate over the Origenist controversy, even though she always said, oh, I got this from Jerome, because it was not considered appropriate for women to give opinions on, church matters, but she did. Melania the Elder led a prominent churchman, Evagrius, back to his vow of celibacy and taught and converted men. She was instrumental in resolving a schism at Antioch that involved 400 monks, quote, winning over every heretic that denied the Holy Spirit, close quote. She funded and co-founded a double monastery on the Mount of Olives, where her communities engaged in scripture, study, prayer, and charitable works. And here's our dear Olympias, who was a deacon, ordained a deacon by Bishop Nectarius in Constantinople. She used her vast family fortune, and it was immense, to support the church and serve the poor. She founded a large monastery close to Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, where 3 female relatives were also ordained deacons. Roman women of senatorial families soon joined, and the number of women monastics grew. These are just a few examples of 4th century women whose ecclesial witness and authority greatly influenced the Christian communities of their time as well as in times to come. These mothers of the church exercised authority, even though some churchmen forbade them to speak or teach publicly, preferred that women stay at home, and judged women more susceptible to heresy, quote, than men. Yet, Christian women in the 4th century did not keep silent or remain closed. They spoke up about important ecclesial issues. They taught both men and women. They witnessed freely about the Christ with whom they had thrown in their lot. And judging from continued prescriptions from various church fathers, quote, women also regularly baptized and celebrated the Eucharist. So now for conclusion, I'd like to sort of take us inside what it would have been like to attend the funeral or the funerary remembrances of one woman of the early church who I have just dubbed Junia. I don't know what her name is, but I named her Junia because Paul's letter to the Romans names Junia and Andronicus as apostles to the Gentiles along with him. So she's one of the few women named as an apostle in the sacred scriptures. So, as we have seen, evidence from tomb iconography and inscriptions about early Christian women, as well as contemporaneous writings about Mother of the Church, reveal that women exercised governance, served as enrolled widows, deacons, heads of house churches and of monasteries, evangelists, teachers, missionaries, and prophets. In most instances, women governed other women, though there are significant exceptions, such as the deacon Marthana in Seleucia in Turkey, who governed a double monastery at the Martyrium, it's at the shrine of St. Thecla. These early Christian women freely witnessed and preached despite significant opposition. So one could reasonably ask from whence came that strength and inner authority that impelled women of the early church to disregard attempts to suppress their voices. I suggest that what led women to speak rather than to be silent was their faith experience in the risen Christ. And so now let's take a moment and examine one sarcophagus that suggests what at least one Christian woman, who I have called Junia, although her actual name is unknown, what one Christian woman understood to be the source of her inner authority. In the center, we see Junia holding a codex in her left hand, while her right hand is shown with a speech gesture. Arrayed on either side are biblical scenes, including God the Father with Cain and Abel, Christ with Adam and Eve, the healing, and then to our right and Junia's left, we see Christ healing the paralytic, this guy with his little bench. We see Christ healing the blind person. This is the wedding of Cana. You see the little jars with Christ with his miracle wand. And last, we see Christ at the tomb of the raising of Lazarus. And at his feet, a small figure, which, depending on which scholar is looking at it, described as Martha and Mary, but could also be Junia in an embedded figure. We don't know. So that's the tomb. Several years before she died, Junia or her family would have commissioned this uniquely sculpted sarcophagus to memorialize her and the values that shaped her identity. When Junia died, her sarcophagus would have been delivered to her home, where she would lie in state for up to 7 days, so family members, clients, and friends could pay their respects and gaze upon her carefully carved memorial. They entered a liminal space, this sort of space, the thin places are what the Irish call it, but this thin space between here and the beyond to reflect upon Junia's life, her values, her beliefs, and inevitably, of course, the meaning of life and death. Janet Tulloch, who is a specialist in early Christian images, has observed that ancient art was viewed as social discourse. This is sort of different from how we think of it, but Tulloch says ancient art was viewed as social discourse that was meant to draw us, the viewers, in as participants, and that ancient art was understood to perform meaning and not simply embed them. So, using Tulloch's criteria, it's possible that Junia wished her loved ones to enter into a liminal space, this liminal sacred space, and experience Christ's power to reverse the effects of the fall from paradise, namely healing the blind and lame, providing an abundance of wine in the new reign of God, and raising Lazarus and Junia from the dead. But where did Junia find her authority to witness and teach about Christ? And a hint is found, I think, in a close-up of the face on her tomb, her face, which has been carefully sculpted close to the face of Christ. Christ leans in with mouth open as if to whisper in her ear. Junia and her family wished her to be remembered as someone who taught with the authority of Christ. Her mourners commune not only with the departed Junia, but also with the Christ who heals and raises up through the meaning evoked and performed by the art on her sarcophagus. Junia exhorts the living to embrace the Christ who authorized her ministry and to whom she witnesses from beyond the grave. She joins a sisterhood of Christian women, past and present, who obey an authority that supersedes any who would silence them. Junia is one of countless women who witness that they are made in God's image and called to serve in persona Christi and in the person of Christ and proclaim the gospel of Christ. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you for your attention. So I guess we can open it for questions. I don't know whether to stop share or not. I think I'll leave it up for now in case people want to refer to one of the images or other. But anyway, over to you all.
Thank you, Professor Schenk.
Mhm.
We are quite interested on these topics that are and we are beginning to get questions. The first question is from Elena Coraza, and it says, what took to so much submission of women in the structure of Catholic Church, and women were led to second or third layer for so many centuries? What led to such submission?
Well, I think that is a very complex question, and we could probably teach a course on it. But I think that part of the, at least in the first 5 centuries, which I feel the most qualified to speak about, the church was trying to survive in a culture that had different values than the original values of Jesus. I couldn't go into all of it, but Jesus included women in his Galilean discipleship. Luke 8, 1-3, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and many other women accompanied him around Galilee. Women were the first witnesses to the resurrection. All 4 Gospels attest to that. And certainly women within the early church were among the leaders, in the house churches. The men, the pushback that they were getting from, not all of them, of course, but certainly more and more, as the institutional, or not the institute, but this small early Christian community was trying to survive in a culture that did not equally value women. They there were women prophets, especially like in Asia Minor and other places, who were leading worship in public spaces and incurring persecution on the early communities. And so the leadership gradually evolved, and the whole Episcopal model of leadership with one bishop in one Christian community evolved. There was more and more pushback against the public leadership of women, and it was partly to survive in that culture. So that was the roots of it. Um, you could also ask the question, why were women subservient in pretty much every culture in the world, and so many to this day? So I think it's part of the original sin, part of our early stories. Let's blame, in the Christian context, let's blame all sin and fall of paradise on the woman, on Eve. So again, it is part of the original sin that we do not honor the full dignity of women to this day. And I think that's why the efforts of so many scholars, and I'm just one very tiny one compared to the work that has been done by feminist scholars, not only in religion, but also in history, to restoring some kind of gender balance to what is our history as a human family, with both women and men making that history. So all this thing about going to archaeology to find the history of early Christian women, it's also finding the early history of women in just in general and of the poor. I think certainly in Catholic Christianity, I think the clerical system is one of the things that it's sort of deeply rooted in this story that is not accurate. And so that's why I feel so passionate about this work that I'm doing, to help all of us retrieve the hidden history of women and religious authority. I think in some ways, the Christian story has also been enriched by the stories of women saints, the women doctors of the church. But I think until we have a full dignity of women in Catholic Christianity, it's certainly happening more quickly in our Protestant communities where women can serve in ministry. Right now, women cannot, in Catholicism, women cannot even preach at Mass. So always we hear our sacred stories through the male lens. And so I think it's important for the whole community, both women and men, to hear Jesus preach through a female experience as well as a male. Thankfully, the Synod on Synodality is working on that in terms of in the Catholic Church of advancing lay preaching. And I would say with Future Church, what their Catholic women preach. Anyway, I'm going too long, but I hope I sort of addressed it a little bit.
If you could slow down a little bit, because Portuguese is longer, okay? And Susanna is saying, thank you, Professor. As you are talking about the voice of women in preaching, I'd like to mention that we, in our website, we have a tab of spirituality where we have the ministry of the word in the voice of women. So every week we have
Yay,
a couple of women that will comment on the word. It's not a
wonderful.
celebration, but at
Yeah, that's
least
great.
it's
Yeah, thank you.
possibilities. So we go to the next question by Marlise Ritter. She says, in face of this amazing history, would it be fair that today we we had women diacons in our churches? Why are the winds so much against that in our church today?
I wish I knew. I think it's fear, frankly. I think it's fear of um, women. Whether we like it or not, in the clerical system, so many men are educated, removed from a normal interaction with a diverse community. You can always, I mean, this is personal, but you can always tell the priests that aren't afraid of women if they have sisters. So and I don't know what it's like around the world, but certainly in the United States for a while, priests are educated to stay away from women because it might impact their ability to maintain their celibacy. So I don't understand why there's no recognition of the need for the whole community for pastoral care. So I honestly think that, and when you look at who is sort of rising in the ranks up over to Rome and the decision making, it's usually the true blue believers who don't necessarily at all understand or appreciate the importance of gender balance in the church, and I think there's a certain fear of it. So there's indisputable that there were women deacons, as this presentation has shown. There's just a fear of change, and so I think for me, having worked on this for much of my life, I just know that God cares about this far more than I do. So even though I care about it a lot, I honestly believe that it's going to take a conversion. It will take a massive intervention from the Holy Spirit upon our brothers to change the practice. Now, the good thing is that Francis is promoting more and more women, Pope Francis, into the Curia and into decision-making authority. This worldwide synod, it's been a 3-year process, and every country spoke powerfully about the need to incorporate more women in decision-making structures. But until governance in the Catholic Church rests with baptism rather than ordination, I'm not sure how much hope there is. So that's my own view on it, but I believe in the power of the Spirit to do more than we can ask or imagine, and that's, and people sometimes say to me, why do you even stay? And it's like, well, why would I leave? I'm a face of Catholicism too. You know, I, this is Catholic, I'm Catholic. So, and why would I, if I went away, we will never, achieve that egalitarian values so valued in Jesus and his discipleship. I mean, most people think it was Jesus and 12 men running around Galilee. They don't get that it was an gender balanced discipleship. And to me, that is what we must aspire to.
Thank you. We have one more question by Pamela Barbosa. When history or art have registered the change in the role of women in church?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Are you asking at what point did the history or art do that? I think it's just been recently uncovered, but you can find obviously in the catacomb frescoes and in the art. I think the other piece is more and more women become specialists in early Christian imagery, like Dr. Janet Tulloch, and actually Steinberg and Janet Huskinson, and there are women art historians who have done wonderful work in this field. And it's sort of like anything else. Once you bring in the lens of the people who have not had a chance to view it, you see things that they see things that we don't, or that the mainstream scholars have not. And so as more and more women have entered into these very fascinating fields, we're discovering more and more about women's roles that until now were only understood through mostly male lens of what the literary record said. So now we have this other viewing point of what was the situation of women, and it's telling a different story than what we read in the literary record. So I don't know if was that really the question, or did I miss something?
Thank you. We have more comments and more questions, so we'll go on.
Okay.
If the person who has the question needs more light on it, then we can leave it for later. Marilena Lorscheider says, congratulations for this study. We know that throughout history, women have gone through many oppressive contexts, patriarchalism, and in the beginning of Christianity, there was a genuine way of living together in the relations. We have a lot to walk in a responsible way. That's a comment by Marilena Lorscheider. If you would like to comment on it, please do it.
Yeah, I think certainly in the earliest communities, when, and thank God Paul wrote the letter to the Romans, because he was on his way to Rome, hoping to raise money for a trip to Spain. And at the very end of the letter, and of course it was Phoebe, the diakonos from Kenkre, who carried the letter to Rome and, in all likelihood, proclaimed the first letter to the Romans. But one of the conventions was Paul didn't know anybody in Rome. So when he wrote the letter, at the end of the letter, he named all the people in the Roman faith community that knew him and that could testify to him. And so that's where we read about Phoebe and diakonos, a prostatis, a benefactor. We read about Prisca and Aquila, who with Paul, actually, they were in Corinth, I think, some 10 years before Paul ever arrived. So Prisca and Aquila had already started this foundational early community in Corinth, at which Paul then arrived and used it with them as a base of evangelization through the tent making business in Corinth. It worked out so well that he had them he sent them to Ephesus to start another base community there. So in these earliest house churches, it's very clear there was gender balance in the leadership. And usually when with Eucharist, whoever's home it was would be the one to host the Eucharistic table fellowship while others did teaching. So, then we've got Junia and Andronicus, the missionary couple who are called apostles, and a number of other evangelists and women leaders named in Romans 16. So, from what we can read and understand from these early churches, and like Tabitha also was another in Joppa, some hypothesize that she was part of the early Galilean discipleship, which is why Peter got there so fast, that it tells us in Acts. So there was this much more, it was all about the mission, It's about the mission of Jesus, and both women and men were on fire with it, and that was the main thing. It was not about always fighting who's on first, So I thank you for that question. There's probably a lot more to be said about some of these early communities, but again, they were like in Rome. There's some 20 titular churches that were original, and titular means that they have a title, so that they were house churches first. And Rome actually was the very last place that had a monarchical episcopacy. It took quite a number of years before that evolved. And Grapte was the leader of the communities of widows and orphans. And with the shepherd of Hermas, writes this letter to Hermas. A beautiful lady appears to the shepherd of Hermas and tells him to write 2 books, give one to Grapte and one to Clement. Those were the 2 leaders of the early Roman church in the 2nd century. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of how there was much more of a gender balance in leadership in these early communities. I don't pretend to know much more, too much about that, except for the figures that I've studied. So I don't know if that, but I think the point is, it is about proclaiming Jesus. That's the first thing. And so whatever works best for that, that's what we need to do. And I think the early, again, I'm retrojecting back, and it's probably not valid, but when I like to think about it, I think about that's what they were on fire with. And those were the values that were driving, who was doing what. And the early church critic Chelsus complained that, these early Christians, they're being led by women, and these are going to the wool dresser shop and the carpenter shop and proclaiming Jesus. That's a little snapshot of how the gospel was being spread through the house church community. So just, I don't know, that's a little garbled, but I thank you for the question. I think it is about communities. See, that's the other piece I think that's extremely important in all of this is finding a faith community in which you are supported, nurtured, and from which you can proclaim the good news of Christianity as a way to live life in a way to witness to the prophetic values of Jesus about right relationship, um, care for the poor, raising up the poor. So I'm not so sure that has changed so much because I think there are many communities that do that all over our world, um, against all odds, you know. So that's got to be the value, I think, trying to find people with whom you can be supported and live within those values so that we can witness even unto death as they did in the first 5 centuries.
Thank you, Professor Christine. We have more comments. Elena Coraza says that there is a fresco on Paulo and Tecla at the same level of authority. Only the eyes were covered to
Yeah,
remove authority. So she mentions the book by John Dominic Crossan and Jonathan Reed, In the Search of
yeah.
Paul. And she says, if it does not, if it's part of your research, however, it has the same meaning.
Yes, and that fresco is in Ephesus, and whoever, you know, it shows you the hostility toward women, prominent women. And the woman whose eyes are X'd out is actually not Thecla herself, it's her mother. But most people wouldn't have known that, and most people wouldn't have uh, most people, like the contemporaneous women, all they would have known that this was a woman of prominence featured with Paul. So it's a testimony to sort of the antagonism toward women of power and authority. Because even in the frescoes, Thecla in the fresco, and I don't have a copy of it right here, but Thecla is up in the window looking down at Paul because the struggle was between Thecla's mother, who didn't want her to go and be with Paul, and Thecla heard him preach from her window and canceled her marriage, whereupon her family turned her over to the authorities. And see, so when I talk about choosing celibacy undermined one of the pillars of mandatory marriage, a patriarchy, which was mandatory marriage, Thecla's story is that on steroids. And even though it's not known whether Thecla was actually a, a historic figure, we do know that the women's communities and the Christian communities who venerated her for 4 centuries, and certainly in Asia Minor, there were many women who were doing what Thecla was doing. And that's one of the reasons why it was such a popular story, but it was also a reason why the persecution in the East raged in Asia Minor. And again, it was likely, I think, because so many women were going beyond the bounds of what the mainstream society thought was appropriate. So anyway, thanks. It's a very interesting fresco.
We have many comments and we only have 10 minutes. So I'm
Okay.
going to skip the comments and I'll concentrate on the questions. Aurea Marques says, the level of awareness on female protagonists in general can still grow much more in Christian fundamentalism. The question is written in a difficult way. Maybe fundamentalism would justify that. And Raquel Cabral says, once during a class on Christ, a student asked me what impact would there be over culture if the word made flesh would be a woman. How would you answer that? Did you get the questions?
Yes, I did. And this is more in the realm of theology than archaeology, but in fact, because we have been baptized into Christ, the Word, women are also Word made flesh because we image Christ. And so that's part of the beauty of, I think, Christian mysticism, Christian theology, is that, it didn't stop with Christ raised up. I mean, have been given the Spirit to be Christ's presence, be Christ's body now on earth. Christ has no body now but ours, Teresa of Avila says. So in a very real way, women already are Word made flesh. And but to get back to the other part of it, and I've been interested to read what different people have said about this. Um, some people say that if Christ had been born a female, nobody would have paid any attention to what he said because that's what women always said. Love one another, care for the poor. Um, so the fact that it was a male who was saying these things had more impact, uh, you know, sociologically, and certainly I don't know, it might be sort of a spacious argument, but there was a way it made sense to me. The last shall be first. Um, is so who were the last in almost every culture? It's the women and the children. So I don't know. But I do think I don't want to get too stuck on what was, because I think what we have to know that now, through the power of grace and through our support in our different communities, we need to own who we are as God's word meant to be proclaimed to a world so much in need of it, out of our Christian values. Now, I am Christian, I own it fully, but I revel in it, but it's also, as Francis said, there are many languages about God. So we're also in a time when we need to learn one another's languages about God. So I think the last thing Jesus would want would be some kind of triumphalist Christianity that's better than whatever wisdom other people have to offer. I think we need to be in conversation about the God mystery, which is bigger than any of us can imagine. So anyway, that's a whole other topic and far away from fourth century sarcophagi. But I like the question. Thank you.
Thank you. We have Lucia Weller that asks if it's possible to receive bibliographical references consistent on Jerome in women like Marcella, Paula, and Eustaquia.
Yes, I'd be happy to send that. They're wonderful. Elizabeth Clark has done wonderful, wonderful work, and she was actually the mother of the mothers of the church. She wrote some wonderful things. So I'll be happy to send that along, and you can share it with whomever.
Oh, good. It's not going to be only Lucia Weller who's going to be interested. We have Pamela Barbosa that says that her question is, when in history, the one that asked the other one question, when in history does the woman lose her important role that she had in the beginning of Christianity? What happened historically for the church to reduce so much the role of women? She's explaining her previous question.
Yes, thank you. Really, if I had to name a time, it would be around the time of Constantine, when he made in the early fourth century, when he prohibited further persecution of the Christians, but even more so when he and his mother Helena sought to reverse the persecution of the early church. And they poured vast amounts of wealth that they gave to bishops. And so worship moved from the house churches to larger public spaces, sometimes the Roman law courts. sometimes new, huge basilicas built by Constantine, such as St. John Lateran and others. And once worship moved into a public space, women's public leadership was felt to be shameful. And so there was greater and greater pressure on women to be silent in the churches. So in some ways, once the mainstream culture came over to Christianity, Christianity lost some of its earlier fire around women being recognized in religious leadership. It's a bit of an oversimplification, but certainly one of the major factors was where worship was held. Women's leadership was expected and accepted in the early house church communities. Once it moved to a public space, it violated Greco-Roman norms about what was a proper place for women to exercise leadership. And it was not in the public space. So just, sorry, I didn't make that very clear earlier.
Thank you. Aurea Marques made a comment where she said there's still much awareness missing in so many women, and even more in the collective initiative, because alone it's too hard to face all that. And then she asks a question: Jesus' proclamation did not move women into a new awareness?
I think some of Jesus' most passionate followers were women. And so I think his proclamation did move them to a greater ownership of their dignity, especially when you look at that women were the first to proclaim the resurrection. It was remarkably countercultural to have women with the male discipleship. I mean, that just didn't happen. Men usually did not speak to women in public spaces who were not in their inner kinship circle. Yet you see again and again examples of Jesus not paying any attention to that, whether it was the Samaritan woman, his defense of the dignity of women, the healing of the bent over women. So you see so many vignettes from Jesus' life that are historical in the Gospels. They have a historical root of women's Jesus' regard for women. And I think women heard that very powerfully. So there was another piece. Oh, I think just the comment about how difficult it is. I think none of us could take on the prejudice of larger cultures without being part of a base community of support. I know for me in my own work, if it had not been for my faith community, my parish that was very much like this, but also the many supportive women who and men who believed in this vision, I would not have been able to do it. So I think that you can't, it's never good to be a lone wolf out there, regardless. I do think, plus, we all need the balance, the Spirit's voice in us, but also the Spirit's voice in others to help us know what direction to go. So there's a discernment piece in all of our Christian living that is extremely important. And that happens within community. You know. And I think I should give credit to my own religious community, the Sisters of St. Joseph, who have supported me 1,000% throughout this, even though there was a time when we were being persecuted, you know, we being when I was at Future Church. So no longer, now we're at the Synod. What a difference a Pope makes.